How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good. All right. Well, so this will be the last day of the actual instructive part of the course. I think we probably will have to start considering what we want to do next as we are moving forward. But before we jump in, do any of you follow the news much?
Sort of.
Nothing. So we're since we're talking about constitutional law right now, we're at a pretty big, significant time in our history concerning one in particular court case that has come up to the justices again, and that's the case of Roe versus Wade. So does anyone familiar with Roe versus Wade? All right, so Roe versus Wade basically holds that the federal government can mandate that abortions are legal. And so it's been a pretty widely contested judgment for quite some time, but with a new court case coming forward, and with the first time in many, many years where the justices on the court lean to a more conservative point of view. With our last president nominated 3 different justices, and so the way that the 10 justices are comprised now, there are 7 who were nominated by conservative presidents, 3 who were nominated by liberal presidents, and so generally speaking, you have a more liberal, a more conservative point of view. And what was just leaked over the last few weeks is that it looks like the Supreme Court justices have determined to overturn Roe versus Wade. And so it's caused a great deal of panic within conversations, because you have one side of the aisle that would say that it's removing women's rights because women should have a right to control their own bodies and determine what kind of medical care is considered. The other side of the aisle obviously would say that anytime that somebody is pregnant, that life is actually life. And so it's kind of a hotly debated conversation, and I think it's, without going too much into it, important for us to understand, because one of the things that is going on currently is there's a lot of shouting from both sides, as it were, that aren't really understanding what the determination of the court is. And so this comes down again to, as we reflect upon the Constitution and the rights that are laid out in the Constitution, the question of Roe versus Wade, as is decided now, comes down to a question of whether or not the federal government has the right to determine that as a valid court case, or if it actually is the right of the states to vote. And so in this light, when we're looking at constitutional law, you remember there's kind of the separation of how do we determine whether or not it's okay for the courts to decide something federally versus it to go back to the states. Do you guys remember the general rule there?
The rule for what?
So the Supreme Court has to determine whether or not that law is federally protected. So if there's a right that's federally protected, and if it's not, then it would go back to the states to determine. And so it's an important distinction to make, because again, we have the balance of powers between the federal government and the individual state governments. And so the reason that it's important is because, does the Constitution say anywhere in it that there is a particular right in this regard? So if the argument is, and I want you guys to debate this a little bit, if the one side is saying, so we'll take one side first, they're saying that women should have a right to health care without being infringed upon, the right to make decisions about their own body. So taking a look at that, if that was the case, right, if that was just simply that, what in the Constitution would provide them that right, or does it provide them that right?
I don't know which one it is specifically, but I feel when you just say something about the right to live freely.
The right to live freely, right?
Yeah.
And so it could be properly understood in that regard, right? Like there should be a right for me to do what I want to do. And that would be the argument on one side of it, right? Is that I have the right to control my own healthcare decisions and all of that. If you remember not too long ago, there was quite a lot of talk about forcing people to get vaccines. And so kind of using that same mentality, right, we might say, well, if it's my body, I get to determine what happens to it. What would be the counter argument, though, if somebody was saying, well, it's my body, it's my right?
Does that mean the opposite?
What's that?
Does that mean like the opposite?
Yeah, what would
if
be...
I thought it was wrong and you thought it was right.
Right, so if I was, let's say that I was on that side of things and saying, I believe that if I'm presenting to the Supreme Court justices, I believe that a woman should have a right over her own health care, what would be your counterpoint?
I would say you have many ways to not get pregnant in that way. You can do birth control and do other things like that. Also, you're pretty much murdering an innocent unborn child.
Okay.
It's worse than murder. I would think it would be worse than to murder someone who had something deserving and did something wrong instead of an innocent child.
So an innocent child. And so you would be then defending the side of the child. And why would that be an important distinction to make on your side?
Because it would be, like in the Constitution, how it says anyone born in America is a citizen, so...
Right, but if the child isn't born yet...
It still makes him a citizen, doesn't it?
I don't know. That's what do you guys think? Does that make him a citizen? Because the Constitution is clear that if the child is born in the United States, they're a citizen. But what about children that are in utero? They have not yet been born. Do those individuals have rights?
That was my understanding. I don't know how to...
What do you think?
Are you not a human if you are...
That's a great question. So let's go around the room and what do you think? Do children who are not yet born in our country, we'll limit it to naturalized citizens, do those children have a right, any rights afforded to them, based just strictly on constitutional law? What do you think? Or just your own opinion, what do you think?
So they don't really have rights.
You would say that they don't, as currently outlined in that. Okay.
From these rules, no.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think they really have a say in anything when they're not born yet.
Okay.
So that's kind of the decision for the person doing it.
Okay.
I would agree with maybe the same thing, but I still don't think it's necessarily right, because if the child is unborn, it doesn't mean it still deserves to die just because it doesn't have any rights, like legal rights. But I mean, it's a creation of God, so pretty much it has a right to live.
Yeah,
it was made purposely.
So we're kind of at a difficult point here. On one hand, we may not be able to find, at least at its face value, where we can definitively say there's a right there. And particularly if we look at the amendment that does say, well, you have to be born in this country to be a citizen, right? One could argue again that, and they do, the argument would be on that side that if life truly begins at conception, then you have rights that are given to you not by the Constitution, but rights by God. Remember, our country was set up, right, that we have certain unalienable rights, and those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So one could argue, and they do on that side of things, to say, well, although it's not explicitly stated here, we can assume rights given to those do not come from merely what we have determined in Constitution, but there are rights that are afforded to all mankind that go beyond the scope of this. And so that's kind of one of the debates now. So let's change the question then. And Kayla kind of posed this. And so maybe we don't find a clear way that we can justify them having rights. Does that mean then that from a moral perspective that abortion should be legal?
Yeah.
Why not?
Because you're murdering a child, pretty much. An innocent child.
Would anyone disagree with that it's murder? Or does everyone feel pretty comfortable with that justification? Right, so that would be the a very particular side of things, right? And so we have two kind of arguments that ultimately are, that we're coming forward. And so what the Supreme Court is determining, and the decision that it looks like will come forward, will actually not. What is being communicated in a lot of the media is that abortion will be illegal. That's actually not true. The Supreme Court does not have the right to create laws. So the Supreme Court cannot make a determination to create a law out of nowhere. The Supreme Court, again, remember, decides whether laws are just. And so in this light, what the Supreme Court is saying is this is not a federal, there's no laws on the book federally that make abortion illegal or legal. And so there's nothing to justify us upholding Roe versus Wade because it was wrongly decided, because the Supreme Court has no power to control it federally, which would mean then that the law, as it's stated as far as abortion goes back to the 50 states. And so each of those states would then have to determine whether or not it was legal. Now, roughly speaking, we have 50 states. There are already 23 states, something to that effect, that have laws that are already written. So if Roe versus Wade was overturned, it would automatically revert back to abortion being illegal. We know that there are absolutely states, Washington, Oregon, California, New York, that will be safe harbors for abortion, and will likely be very, very difficult to overturn. And so the important thing, and the reason why I want to bring this up is not to make you uncomfortable and have a debate on the subject, because I think we're all pretty much in agreement from a moral standpoint why abortion should be outlawed. The question that we have to ask ourselves around this is kind of getting back to the main question we asked as we started, is that if the government and the Constitution was set up with the idea of we the people in order to form a more perfect union, how do we debate and have conversations around subjects like this? Because again, you have people who are pretty adamant that what they feel like is that a woman's right is being taken away, and you have people that are really adamant that would say this is murder. And so who's justified here? Particularly since we're coming from a standpoint of deeply, widely entrenched views. And so stripping away a little bit for a minute the moral understanding of it, because I think understanding that God has knit us together in our mother's wombs, and biblically speaking, there's no call for abortion. How do we debate? And how do we discuss? And how do we push forward this idea, right? Again, if our premise is we're trying to create a more perfect union, how do we as individuals then dialogue, discuss, debate, convince, persuade? Because ultimately that's what you're doing, is it not, with your essays, hopefully. Not necessarily for this particular issue. But again, what I'm hoping to get at least in the way that we set our minds to understand culture and how we engage in culture and how we create culture that's healthier, there has to be room for healthy debate. Today, as we look at the last few amendments, and then really we've hit kind of a silent period where there's not been any amendments, it's really clear to see why. We are increasingly living in a culture that does not embrace the ideal set forward in the preamble. The goal of our politics, as it's currently constructed, is not trying to create a more perfect union. We have factions, political parties that are trying to create things in their own image. They fall vastly short of ultimately what we understand to be a good culture, which is the house of God, right? The culture of God, which is radically different. And so we see silence has kind of taken the place, in, at least constitutionally speaking, and has been replaced for vitriol. And so we have a lot of people that, again, instead of engaging on the topic and having a conversation around the topic, there's a lot of shooting across one another and a lot of accusations that are made. And one of the most common things that will come up will be people will present what's called a straw man argument. Have you ever heard that saying? So from a debate standpoint, what a straw man argument would be for me to create. So let's say Elijah and I disagree with something. We're having a debate, and Elijah says his point, and then I take his point and I make it totally something different. I don't repeat back what he said at all. I create this imaginary person. And I accuse Elijah, well, this is what you're saying, and that's why this is wrong. And so a straw man is not arguing face to face, the real point. It's creating something that will be easily to topple over. So again, using abortion as an example, a good example of a straw man argument is some people will say, well, only women should have the right to determine whether that's appropriate or not, because only women could understand that. So why would that be a straw man argument? Should men be able to speak into whether or not abortion is morally correct or not? Or do you have to only be somebody who can experience pregnancy?
I wouldn't think so. Because if you were the father of that child and you and your wife disagreed on something, it's still your offspring, not just theirs.
Right. And so there could be an argument made to say the value of that. Now, again, people would push back against that and say, well, it's not your body, so you don't have any say. But what is the detriment to my argument there? If I'm on the side of it can't be a man's right to decide, what do I undermine? So let's play that out a little bit. If the man has no determination in that, what does it create? I mean, obviously, it's easy to say in the context of marriage, it would create a great deal of stress, would it not?
Yeah.
if the husband was looking forward to having a child and the wife determined to abort the child, that would create disharmony within the home. But let's strip that away, because the more common, more likely common outcomes are with people who are unmarried. And so now we kind of strip away again that there's no commitment there, right? So should he still have a justifiable say in some of that? Because he's not the right, again, the straw man would be, well, he's not the one who's going to have to carry it, and he's not going to have any responsibility, and he's not going to have to do anything, which is true. But what would be the problem, the long-term problems of separating out responsibility? If we say that a man is not responsible for making that decision, would it not then be logical later on down the line for men who didn't want to have kids to argue, why should I have to pay child support? Because it wasn't my body, it wasn't my choice. So we create some problems there, correct? And so we all will do this at times, by the way, create straw man arguments for ourselves, where we won't listen to what the person's saying and we'll attack them, that other person, or disagree with them by creating something that they didn't mean.
Seems like in that case, the argument is there is like who should make the choice, rather than should there be a choice at all, which is what the legislation is around.
Right.
So that's why it's a straw man, because it's not about who should make the choice, it's should there be a choice at all.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, very good. And so it's easy to when we debate people to get people off track, and we begin to start arguing about things that we aren't saying. And so this is why to kind of instruct how we would come at debating this would be, and my encouragement would always be, I think popular Christian culture right now is matching the shouting of the other side and coming at it from a very worldly perspective instead of walking in humility, walking in love, seeking to understand. And so a good way to diffuse this argument would be to do what? To win the argument back to your side. So what is the point of the conservative side? The question is it a life? Yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
We would say yes. And when would we say that life begins? At conception, right? So as soon as the child is conceived. Well, some people may disagree with that. And so what would be the next logical question, instead of attacking somebody who disagrees, if I were, let's say, on the opposite side and Kayla asked me the question, what is life? And I said, well, life begins at when the child finally takes its breath outside of the mother's womb. What would be kind of a next logical follow-up question for that?
Why, if you were fighting against it, why wouldn't you do something to prevent pregnancy if you're not wanting to get pregnant?
So that would be a good argument. But what does it do? But starting there does what? It kind of attacks the person and their judgment, right? And so we got to be really careful how we apply that question. Although it's a good question, well, you could have avoided it. Could sound accusatory. not a bad question, but probably not the first question we would follow up with. And again, I want to have this conversation because when we talk about constitutional stuff, remember the goal is what? Creating a more perfect union. We do that by compromise, debate, discussion. We can never just do that kind of outside of a struggle, right? We all know that there's difficulties in life that bring us to better outcomes. It's generally, as a rule, generally never just the easy things that we get where we learn from them. We struggle. We saw that last week, right? The Civil War brought us really far advancement as far as our Constitution was concerned, but it came at a really, really great cost. So what might be another follow-up question? So if a person says, well, I believe then that life starts as soon as there's a breath. Or does the debate end there? It's okay to not have an answer right away. This is not an easy conversation to have, and you might never find yourself in this debate.
Could I say, well, when does the child have a heartbeat? Does that make any difference? Does it make any difference if the child has a heartbeat because it has a heartbeat in them?
Yeah. So I might ask like that. So is the only standard them taking a breath? So does that mean that we shouldn't protect, other things that don't take breath? I mean, we can ask a lot of follow-up questions here, right? Like, what about the child feeling pain? And so what is the difference between the minute before birth and the minute after birth? From a pain standpoint, if nothing has changed other than a breath, like that seems like a pretty narrow view of what life means. And so we can begin to have some conversations around that. And again, we'll kind of curb it short here. Kind of the point of this is to get us to think in terms of how do we dialogue in difficult situations. The tendency here has been kind of, I don't know what to say. I don't know if I'm going to say it right. And so we may not risk being vulnerable at times. We may not have an honest answer, and so we might kind of refrain from that. We might find, this is probably not a productive conversation. It's not a conversation I'm going to win, so I'm just going to refrain from even engaging in this. But my hope is that we begin to understand that really the culture building from a strictly constitutional standpoint requires dialogue. And it's going to require some uncomfortable conversations to take place. Just like last week we talked about, imagine how uncomfortable the conversation is back a while ago to say whether black people had a right to anything. I mean, nowadays, think about having that conversation in today's culture. That would be an uncomfortable conversation. Well, what about, let's have this conversation. Should women have the right to vote? I mean, come on, because you guys know how women are.
Aren't you considered a woman after you're 18, though?
Right. So, you can have all of those arguments. So why should women vote?
Because if they are a citizen, doesn't matter what gender you have, you should have the right to vote because if you were born or born in America or legally an American.
But they're women. I mean, why should a woman get that right to vote, Esther?
Once they learn how to drive, then they can.
When they learn how to drive. So we put stipulations on it. How about once they're married? Once they have a kid?
What would be the difference?
What would be? Well, so let's ask that. What was that? What was the difference? Because as we stated last week, right, we just determined in our history that not only are African Americans considered now, as we've gotten through the amendments here, whole persons, but that men can actually vote. But we didn't get to the point where we allowed women to vote. Why not?
Oh, sorry, what was your question?
Why did we still not allow women to vote?
It was one small step
It
at
was-
a time.
It was one small step at a time.
Because in those times, women were considered in a different way, more of a, still people in those times, but more of almost like a helper in life. That's how things were back then. I mean, everyone knows that. And so,
Like they had a purpose that they were supposed to fulfill, and then once that was fulfilled, they were kind of
and yeah, and the purpose wasn't seen as being needed to vote. So.
And what was their purpose? Ladies, what was their purpose?
to have kids,
And
clean,
Take care of the
home.
take care of the home.
Sweep.
Sweep the floor. Well, yeah, we can joke about that, but there were we're talking about cultural norms, and we look back on those days and we chuckle about them as if they're a bad thing. Now, women should have always had the right to vote. We can agree on that now. That probably would have been healthier back then. But let's not confuse some of the cultural things that took place as far as the role and the responsibility of the wife and mother in the household. Because now you live in a culture, and for you ladies in particular, you live in a culture that is increasingly hostile towards the idea of any woman who would want to stay home with her kids, would want to raise their kids, teach their kids. I mean, like, your parents, your moms, are like really not looked at very fondly from a cultural perspective now. Because the culture now really believes, has this thought of like, it came with the feminist movement, that women need to be empowered and that they're not just as equals, but better in many ways, and that they don't need men. We don't need all of these definitions. And so we're increasingly in a culture that undermines. And so yeah, we can say their job was to sweep the floor and we can laugh about it and chuckle about it. And I think that's a lighthearted thing to do. But if we're not careful, what we can do is we can undermine the value of that culture too. Because obviously things were pretty well at hand as far as the order of the house much longer ago in our history. Yeah.
Since a lot of women, if a lot of women were saying it's like you should be shamed if you were homeschooling your child, wouldn't it be a woman's choice?
Well, that would be would be an argument, right? You could make. Yeah, you could say, well, listen.
Because if
Yeah.
it's okay to
Yeah.
kill an unborn child because of the woman's choice, shouldn't it be a woman's choice to say if they want to stay home with their child?
Yep, that would be a
if
good way to
Or
argue.
if they wanted to be a good wife, and well, I mean, that doesn't make you a bad wife if you don't want to clean or stuff like that. But from my standpoint, I would think, yeah, you should be a good wife and cook for your husband and your kids and clean and stuff. But also, your husband should honor you in that way and help you with those things.
Right. And so there's room for that debate, right? You just demonstrated a good way that we can turn people's debates against themselves, because a lot of people have inconsistencies in their arguments. Our arguments should always be consistent, right? And so if we're going to apply one thing, right, my life, it's my choice, if we're going to follow that up to its logical conclusion, then that means that everyone has the freedom to do that as well. And so again, as we're getting into this conversation of why is there women having the right to vote? Why did that give us a more perfect union? Let's not throw out historically healthy parts of culture, because the danger we get into, even in this culture shaping, and we'll see where we make mistakes and we have to come back. In culture shaping, sometimes if we're not careful, what we do is we just dismiss everything of a culture instead of being selective and saying, you know, this is some healthy things about that culture. These were some unhealthy things about that culture. Let's not rid ourselves of the healthy things. And so as we go through here, we're going to talk a little bit about that, because as we got women's suffrage and women had the right to vote, and we had mixed with men who had wrong ways of thinking towards women. And so two cultures began to clash. A changing culture and some really negative aspects of an older culture began to clash. What it created was a straw man that could be easily knocked down, and why we see a lot of the problems we see now culturally today between men and women, and confusion about what is a man, what is a woman, what is a man's role, what is a woman's role, right? And for anyone who grew up with biblical understanding, you would have a different perspective, right? A different culture, and how to see that. Because does the Bible say that women are lesser beings? No, you don't find that anywhere in Scripture at all. No, but there's an order to things, right? And so in proper order does it bring unity or does it bring disunity? Proper order? Improper, yeah. Improper order brings disunity, right? So proper order brings health and security and safety. But does having something with proper order exclude us from having difficulty? No. And again, this is why we are studying the Constitution. So where did we leave off? We're going to be in Amendment what?
I think we already finished all the amendments.
No, we didn't quite get there yet. We're in Amendment 16. And so Amendment 16 came up. It says, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes. For those of you who get paychecks, you have a thing called FICA, right? Federal income taxes that are taken out. And so this is actually an amendment, and it's a right that the government enjoys. And so we see for the first time, really, one of the amendments that doesn't seemingly, at its face value, have anything to do with individual right. And so why is income tax important for a more perfect union? So why is it important that the government takes a chunk of your money?
Well, they can be using it for something good. Well, I'm not necessarily saying that our government has done an amazing job with the things they've done with our money, but like redoing roads and helping other people, like maybe homeless shelters and orphanages and other things like that. It can go to a good cause. But again, it also can be taken away and made into unuseful costs, kind of like what they're doing with that bridge next to our place for the fish.
Right, and so, yeah. So the idea of why would it be beneficial to all of us is because an income tax, we need to, as remember, culture is advancing. There are bigger needs. As cities are kind of, no longer like the old West town where you have 2 horses and, now all of a sudden we have automobiles coming, we have paved roads coming, we have fires that, when they rage out of control are not as simple as they used to be. There's all of this modernization that is taking place. And so along with that, there comes some needs for the government to be able to regulate and to control. Why? For the greater good of everyone. Because if left to our own devices, do you think that we would be willing, generally speaking, are most people willing to give up their own money for the sake of other things?
No.
I mean, this is even a frustration now. If you're honest with ourselves and you look at it, you're going, man, this is what I was supposed to get paid an hour, and this is how much money are they taking away? I mean, it can be a frustration. In fact, and Kayla kind of brought up this point, a lot of dialogue around how our money is spent and what laws are passed. And so that would be a really good debate to have as far as like challenging constitutionally why certain things are allowed or permitted or taxes are placed. You could, argue, and some people do, that there are certain taxes that are levied that aren't constitutional. Well, this one says really clearly here, they have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and with regard to any census or enumeration. So basically there's a general idea that the government has a right to tax. So what then the individual would have to do would have to demonstrate that it was unconstitutional because it created a specific burden on specific people, or that it wasn't constitutional in the sense that the monies derived from it wasn't for a specific or good use. And so, again, we want to have this understanding that a healthy culture is one that takes care of one another, right? And so we use the term tax, but from a building the house of God standpoint, right? From a cultural standpoint, what is kind of the mechanism that the Lord has kind of placed in our midst for this kind of understanding of collection of funds for the greater good of God's people?
Tithe.
The tithe, right? And so we know, biblically speaking, right, the tithe goes way back. And it was established as not a, you will comply, but it was derived out of, right, a heart, an understanding heart that is cheerfully giving for the sake of,
A more perfect union.
what's that?
A more perfect
Yeah, a more perfect union, yeah, God's people. That there are things within a community, that there are needs, right? And so, yeah, that's a good and healthy and proper understanding, right? And anything that's healthy, we obviously will understand the purpose for it, and we will be willing to invest. And so, from a personal standpoint, then, we can see income taxes as being, kind of a drain on the system and drain on our personal finances, or again, remembering that the framers didn't give us the Constitution for the sake of individual rights. They would have never thought in those terms, but they would have thought of rights as being a government of the people, by the people, for the people, where it's generated for our common good. All right, moving on. Amendment 17, popular election of senators. And basically this one we've kind of went over already, gives really specific ways of how do we get senators, what happens, if a senator is no longer can serve in the middle of their term, and how we manage that. And without going into a lot of detail in this, basically, again, it was getting around this idea of structure of, like, we want to have consistent votes every 6 years that are already pre-made. So for whatever reason, something comes up in the middle of it, somebody's appointed, we say that the state executive, which would be like the governor of the state, can appoint that person to take over for whomever it is, so that things can be more free-flowing. And so we don't run into the problem of people coming and going and always having this idea of, like, voting, but that we keep their consistency. All right, Amendment 18. We came into the prohibition of intoxicating liquor. And so this was like a really big thing. America went dry, and we made it illegal, right? No beer, no alcohol, no nothing. And that failed miserably, because what it actually did was not reduce the amount of alcohol being consumed. What it did was actually increase the amount of alcohol being consumed. But why they did that, the original understanding behind it, was because intoxicating liquors were not regulated. And so it wasn't just that they wanted for people to not drink, but people were drinking such things as, like, people would say it's bourbon or whatever, and they put turpentine in there. So people were dying and getting sick. And so they actually, and we don't need to go into this because you guys don't need to know, because you don't need to drink, because you guys aren't even of legal age, right? So, and so they actually came out with laws after that of how to manage. In fact, our first rules in history of the United States on how to regulate food was actually how to regulate bourbon. And so we began to see this idea of, in order to create a more perfect union, the goal here was, like, we don't want people to die. But the way that they applied it was just by saying no one can do it, instead of saying, well, how do we regulate this in a healthier way? And so what this does for us, and we'll see here in just a minute, it's the only amendment that's been overturned. So it was repealed. What it does for us is give us insight a little bit in how do we create a more perfect union if we're not really thinking through how we apply it. It's very easy to have a knee-jerk response and just say, well, we're not doing anything, versus saying, well, let's weigh this out, and let's discuss and debate and balance out, right, rights of people versus the good of people. Because, we can't legislate morality in one sense. We can't force people, but we have to make an argument, again, from where our rights come from, and how do we limit rights. And so we then move on, and so who would have thought that in the United States of America that they would outlaw alcohol before they would give women the right to vote? We had women's suffrage come up. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And so the women's suffrage movement came, and we saw now women have the right to vote, which was increasingly important. And it was also we have some symptomology that comes out of a wrong mindset. And so what this women's suffrage teaches us, properly understood, is that you can have a just law because the law is just that women have the right to vote. But when we improperly apply a certain mindset to laws, the outcomes then can become unhealthy. And so what we saw at the when the women's suffrage came forward and women had the right to vote, which they should have, we saw the culture kind of push beyond the boundaries of the culture before, where now women begin to, certain women begin to push back against the old way of things. And so, like I said before, one of the biggest problems were there was a lot of men that were in control and in power and wanted to keep their wives kind of in their place instead of seeing their wives properly understood, right, as helpers, as co-laborers, as co-equals. And what we had created out of that was a movement that kind of pushed back, counterculture. And so we see first time historically now where we have men as one culture and women as another culture, and that this culture of feminism moved increasingly from kind of like we want to have the same rights to a more modern understanding of like hatred towards men. And so again, should women have the right to vote? Yeah, they should have the right to vote from the beginning. We're creating a more perfect union. We finally get to that point, but if we don't understand kind of the ramifications of decisions that were made, and we don't keep the proper mindset towards these, what happens? A culture will spin out of control. In the same way that we have a lot of people that believe, again, that the rights that are outlined in our Constitution are personal rights. It is my right. Well, that's a misunderstanding of what the Constitution says, because the Constitution doesn't say you, the individual, does it? How does it start? We, the people. Right? And so, again, we have to understand this document from a more universal approach that is not about me and what I can get and what my rights are, but it is about us. And the purpose of we is always to create what? A more perfect union. The goal has to be towards something that is good, right? In order to create a healthy culture, you have to have a healthy ideal of what we're after. And so we see the women's suffrage rights comes and goes, and we get then into the terms of the president, vice president, members of Congress, and then again we just kind of really just lay out specific dates. So the 20th of January is when now we have the kind of the official swearing in ceremonies. Congress needs to assemble at least once a year, and such a meeting shall begin at noon on the third day of January. And so we begin to have some kind of general understandings now around laws of how do we observe kind of government. And so the same way that we would observe certain holidays, right? There's an observation of government. And so we observe every fourth year on January where the president is sworn in, whether they're reelected or whether it's a new president, right? There's some consistency there. Every year we have a State of the Union address where there's consistency there. And so we're formalizing now how we do things, because again, the understanding would be going from kind of just doing things whenever to no, let's put some order to how we do it. Why is that important? How does that, I mean, as silly as it sounds, something like putting the 20th day of January as a sworn-in ceremony, how does that lead to a more perfect union?
Making sure it gets done.
Making sure it
It's
gets
better
done.
to have a scheduled time than to just spontaneously come up with it each year. So.
Right. It brings order, right? Order is often planned and consistent and modeled out, right? And again, the danger of that could turn into legalism. With the wrong mindset, it could be very legalistic. But the goal is to bring consistent order. How we observe things consistently is important for a people, for a culture. We know, right, that so currently, looking at gas prices and all of the things that are happening, we know that in 3 years, a little less than 3 years, there's an opportunity to change our government. We know that from a standpoint of right now in November, there's going to be an election, maybe for certain people in the state here, that we can make some changes. And so that order brings health and understanding and consistency, and it offers the individual then an understanding of, I don't like the way things are constructed today, I'm empowered to change them. And so again, any house, any structure, if it has weak points and things aren't in order, the house crumbles, right? A house divided against itself cannot stand. And so again, we're seeing kind of some fallout from the Civil War still of like, we need to really kind of button some things up here and make sure that things are really clearly defined. Because if we have order, there's not confusion. If we know this is when it's happening, then we can plan ahead for that. All right, Amendment 21. We see the repeal of the 18th Amendment. So the 18th article of the Amendment of the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. The transportation and importation to any state, territory, or possession of the United States for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors is a violation of the laws thereof, is hereby prohibited. This article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment in the Constitution by convention in the several states, as provided in the Constitution, with several states from the date of the submission hereof to the states by the Congress. And so what does this teach us? This really says nothing about alcohol. It says a lot more about our ability as a people to understand that creating a healthy culture sometimes means we need to readdress how we go about things. So when we make errors, and in this amendment, they would see that as an error. The goal was to create an environment by which people are healthier. It had the opposite effect, right? All we did was we put people underground. It made things a lot more secretive, and people were affected a lot more negatively by it. So instead of doubling down and saying, well, no, we're gonna do this, they came back and said, okay, that didn't work, so we need to repeal it. We probably overshot the mark here, and again, well-intentioned, but the outcome wasn't healthy. And so what this demonstrates for us is not anything to do with whether liquor is okay or not. It has everything to do with how do we respond when we make mistakes. And so after this amendment was put into place, it got us thinking in large terms about how do we apply specific laws instead of amendments. And so we want to think in terms now of the legislation doing their job, of actually writing good laws so that we don't have to do these grand amendments that cover everything. And so, right, good lawmaking is not blanket statements. Good lawmaking has some flexibility to it. There's certain things that need to be rigid, right? There's absolutely things in building culture that have to be, right? Boundaries that have to be in place. But as it applies to certain laws, we have to have some flexibility here. Because if the intention of the law didn't work, we need to have that flexibility to say, no, we're gonna repeal that, and we're gonna handle it from a different perspective. All right, Amendment 22, presidential tenure. And so, really quickly, how many years can a president serve in office?
5 years?
Like altogether,
Altogether.
they could go 2 terms.
2 terms, 8 years. Yeah. 2 terms, 8 years. Why do we, yeah, so 2 terms, 8 years. Why do we have that number?
You don't want the same person being the president for too long.
Okay. Was there any point in our history where we had more than 8 years, a president for 8 years?
It wasn't.
Wasn't it? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Was the first? Was George Washington?
Nope.
FDR?
FDR. Yeah. And so Kayla didn't know she was, but she was answering my first question. Why do we have 8 years? George Washington had 8 years. After his 2 terms, he decided and determined that he was going to step away because he felt that it wasn't to the benefit of the country to have one person. Mm-hmm. His inclination again was to go against what was the monarchy. Remember, the monarchy was, you were like born into it. He didn't want to have that. He was kind of tired of the public life too, and he wanted to kind of retreat away. And so the reason we have 8 years really comes from the tradition of George Washington having 2 terms in 8 years. But there was nothing at the time that said you could only have 8 years. So one of the mistakes that was made, likely in writing our Constitution, was we never put limits on that. So George Washington could have been president for, how many ever years he was alive, 20 plus. Now that would not be a healthy way to have any kind of presidency, would it? Like imagine that, somebody being in power for that long. So FDR comes along, and he is really beloved, right? He helps save America from the Great Depression. is just really kind of well regarded. But some of his policies kind of introduce a whole different way of doing things that we're still seeing the negative effects of. And so for as good a president as he was in many regards, the whole concept of socialism kind of really comes into place now under his presidency, where he is really making the government now kind of responsible for everyone. And we see for our first time historically where a lot of people kind of go, wait, I can live off the government and not have to go and work. And so we see kind of a mindset trickle in again into the country where it becomes a welfare mindset. Now, he had polio and became really ill, and so we had to now make some determinations of like, okay, this can't be good. We can't just have presidents dying of old age and just dying because they've been in there too long. So we should probably put some laws around this, because at that time they didn't really have some really robust laws to how to manage this. And so first they say in Amendment 22, no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of president more than once. And so it's giving some rules like around like if the vice president takes over 1 year into the 4-year term because the president is assassinated, dies, or whatever, they don't get to have 2 more terms after that because they've already used 3 out of the 4. It's a majority there. And so, and then one of the more important ones as well, Amendment 23, the district constituting the seat of government of the United States shall appoint in such a manner as the Congress may direct a number of electors of president and vice president equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in Congress to which the district would be entitled if it were a state, but in no event more than the least populous state. And so this is where we get that idea of electors and the Electoral College. And so we talked a little bit about this as we started, right? We are not a sheer democracy. It is not a majority gets the presidency. We do things a little bit differently, and so each state has a number of electors. It's based on population, right? And so again, right, we have the House of Representatives, and then we have the Senate. The Senate is equal representation. Every state has 2. House of Representatives is based on population of the state. But what we're saying is when we elect presidents, right, there's certain electors. So the state of California has the most because it has the biggest population. So whoever wins the vote in California, they get all of, generally speaking, all of the electors from that state. And so what this does again is it makes sure that the president doesn't just get voted in by very specific populated areas, but that every state is equally represented. And so you can win some of the bigger populous states, but you have to win a pretty good chunk of the less populated states too in order to be elected president. And so we saw the last time that this happened where in 2016 where Hillary Clinton actually had more votes than Donald Trump did. And so if it was just a sheer democracy, Hillary Clinton would have been president. But because Donald Trump won a majority of states and their electors, he was elected to the presidency. And this amendment makes it really clear. Why do we do that? Because again, we want to have a consistency in how we apply power. And so in any healthy culture, right, there has to be an understanding of it. It has to be we the people. If we don't have this framed out in our Constitution, it becomes increasingly less about we the people and more about the most populated states. And so it's not we the people, it's that particular state and that particular state, and really not states. It becomes more reflexive of like certain cities. So Seattle, LA, San Francisco, New York, Miami, Austin, Houston, bigger cities would control how things are done.
Is that why Washington's a Democratic state? Because the majority of people in Seattle are.
Yeah. So we look out on the peninsula, it's a lot more conservative. You look at Seattle, it's a lot more liberal. Yeah, bigger cities tend to congregate more, as it's constituted now, liberal ideals. All right, next amendment. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary other election of president or vice president, for electors or president or vice president, for senator or representative in Congress shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any reason of failure to pay poll tax or other tax. And so what this did was there used to be like you had to go and pay to go to the polls. and so there was a tax on voting. And they said, well, no. We can't be taxing people, because what does that do? It infringes on the rights of who?
The people.
The people. But what people in particular? The poor. Yeah. And so now the poor aren't equally represented, right? If you can't pay the tax, you don't get a vote. Well, how does a poor person ever get their voice? And so again, seeing that, yeah, that's really unhealthy. We can't go back to this idea of feudalism, right, where the rich are in control and that the poor have no say. We need to protect that. 25th Amendment. In case of the removal of the president from the office or his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. And so that's a pretty basic understanding. Why did it take us so long to figure this out? But we need to have kind of a really clearly defined, let's put it down, how things work. Whenever there's a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by the majority vote of both houses of Congress. Whenever the president transmits to the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits them in a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president and acting president. So this, again, one of the questions that came up was like, well, what happens if a president becomes incapacitated? What do we do? Because let's say that the president just gets violently ill. He's still the president, still alive. But we have to have a way to transfer power. And so there's now kind of this creates for us the opportunity to transfer power peacefully between the president and the vice president in case that the president is unable to. And it says here in writing, and so generally as a rule, right, it's looking at certain aspects where the president says, yeah, I've got to kind of turn this over. But it also kind of adjusts for, like, if the president gets sick, like mentally sick, that there's a recourse for the government to come in and step in and say, hey, we got to transfer power. All right, amendment. Yeah, go ahead.
If you're a vice president, do you get once you become president, do you just finish the other president's term, or do you become okay? Also, since the vice president becomes the president after he's dead or whatever, does that he or she get to have a vice president?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
do you get to pick that? So I could be like, I'm president. I want you to be
yeah.
my vice
So
president.
remember how it started. When it originally was started, we had the vice president was actually the person who had the second most votes, and so you would have a president and then the vice president that were voted on. The reason we got away from this is that we had presidents who were of one party and vice presidents who were of a different party. Well, then the vice president would be counterproductive. And so the goal was, well, we want to have the people be able to vote for a specific platform or group of people that are going to carry on kind of the mandate of the president. Meaning, you don't want to have, like we did when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. We had Abraham Lincoln, who was very favorable to Reconstruction. His vice president who took over for him afterwards was not favorable to Reconstruction. Well, people voted for Abraham Lincoln because he was favorable to that. So this law kind of creates an opportunity where people are voting for 4 years. They want to make sure that in those 4 years, the design of who was voted in or their goals would be established and completed. All right, we're coming home on the home stretch here, and I know we're going just a touch long. But the reduction of voting age, so it went down to 18 years or older. Why?
Well, when you're 18, you start having your own opinion, so that, because I was raised a certain way, I would most likely, as a child, do what my parents do, which I feel like it's still the same difference, because if you're raised a certain way, like I was raised to think that these certain things are wrong, so of course I'm going to believe it.
But this was...
But also,
yeah.
you start to have your own opinion and your own way of thinking when you are 18 years older.
So what happens when you're 18, from a legal standpoint?
You're an adult.
Considered an adult. And the big push behind this, why was it lowered? Because at 18 years old, men could go and fight and die in wars. That was kind of the new established norm. And so this was really kind of around that idea of, if we're going to send people off to die, we should probably give them a say in who they're going to vote for and determine whether or not they're going to get sent off to die. And so it was really coming down to, again, kind of giving the rights of that individual to be able to be represented there. Right. If I'm going to go and fight for my country and have the chance to die, I should have the ability to vote for whether I want that person to that or not.
Mm.
And then lastly is Congressional Pay Limitation, which basically gives kind of some structure, some limited structure to how Congress gets paid. And then we see silence. And so I'll just close with this. There's a reason we have silence within our amendment process currently. It is because we have increasingly become a culture that is not constituted around the idea of we the people. If today's culture were to write the Constitution, it would probably start with I, the individual, in order to serve myself. And that really is the mindset behind it. And so again, what we see from a constitutional standpoint is it's not important just to have a document, but there has to be a mindset and a way of living behind it. In the same way, right? We understand that the Word of God is absolute. But if you don't have the proper mindset to be instructed by it, nor the proper way of living by it, it becomes powerless. Not because the Word of God is powerless, but because we have, as people, made it powerless through our lives. And so properly understood, a healthy culture is represented by whom? The people who live it out in the context of relationships one to another. And why this is important for us, and for you guys in particular, because it's your generation is really the generation that is going to determine how we move forward, not just from a constitutional standpoint, but from a lifestyle standpoint. Your generation is going to be responsible to begin to debate and dialogue and discern these conversations. If you don't have a proper understanding of the structure and then a proper mindset by which to apply the structure, the outcomes and the lifestyle is going to be what? Healthy or unhealthy? If we don't properly apply the right mindset to the right principles and the right structure, we're going to have schism or dysfunction. Our country as it's currently constituted is not a representation of the best of us, but it is often the worst of us. And the unfortunate part is it's not just one party over here, it is both. It is all the parties, the way that it's currently constituted. It's not representative of the people. And so this is extremely important to you guys, whether you know it or not, because the way that you apply and have a mindset towards things like this will determine the outcomes that you will see in your life. Not just spiritually, not just emotionally, not just from a country standpoint, a political standpoint, but for your kids, for their generation. And the question you have to ask yourself, and we'll leave it at this, and we'll get to the essays next week, is, do I desire to be an individual who gets my way, or do I desire to be a person in a community? And if I desire to be a person in a community and not just an individual, then am I willing to do what is required of me to create something that is being perfected, which will then, again, cause me to have to reflect upon myself and limit my rights for the sake of others. All right, that's it. Thanks. Lunchtime. 5 minutes late.
Oh, just